So now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the president of the AFA, Markus Brunnermeier. In a moment, Markus will give this year's presidential address. Let me introduce Markus to you. Markus grew up in Landshut, a small but beautiful city in Bavaria, along the river Isar, an hour from Munich. He went to college close to home in Regensburg, also in Bavaria. He continued his studies in the US at Vanderbilt, where he received a master in economics. He then entered the European doctoral program, first at Bonn, and then he finished his PhD at the LSE in 1999. Since then, he's been at Princeton, where he's the director of the Bentheim Center of Finance and the Edwards Sanford Professor. Markus works on macrofinance. His body of work has had a big impact on our thinking about financial crises. His paper is about the 2007 financial crisis, is a classic reference in many PhD courses. It's a great introduction into the concepts and mechanisms that were at work in 2007. It explains how an initially small decline in US house prices was able to amplify into a global financial crisis. One key mechanism was a liquidity spiral. So even a very small decline in asset values can create funding problems when you have investors that are highly levered. These investors have to either reduce their leverage or sell assets or both. And so in a world without frictions, there would be other investors who would pick up those assets and there wouldn't be a huge asset price decline. But in a world in which everyone may face some constraints, asset values decline and they can drop below their fundamental values, and then you have a fire sale. Markus' earlier work, which was published in 2005, so written way before the financial crisis, had shown that it may be profitable for some investors to force others to unwind their positions at low prices and thereby engage in predatory trading. His 2009 paper shows how fire sales can lead to higher margins and haircuts, which further deepen funding problems in these situations. So liquidity spirals involve negative externalities that investors have on each other. When I sell, I'm creating a problem for you, for your funding. And these externalities, they're typically not picked up by traditional measures of risk, like value at risk, which focus on the risk of a single financial institution. And so Markus came up with the idea of COVAR, a risk measure that takes into account spillovers on other financial institutions. In describing these contributions, I'm already emphasizing one big feature of Markus, which is his ability to come up with the best names. You have to give it to him. The names liquidity spiral, COVAR, or his latest, the resilience thing. It's just, I can't do it, and I don't know how you do it. It's amazing. There's genius in these concepts. When I think about these concepts, I use Markus's words, I immediately adopt them, and I feel like I'm mentally communicating with him about these topics. Another big feature of Markus is that he's a craftsman. In fact, he's from a family with a long tradition of craftsmanship. Markus doesn't work with wood like his father and many generations of previous Brunnermeiers, but he applies his craftsmanship to economic models. And so if you look at his work on financial frictions in macroeconomic models, that's just a beautiful example of craftsmanship. It just has the necessary amount of heterogeneity among agents. It cuts through a whole bunch of complexity in financial markets and the real economy. And then it just isolates the key channel through which a negative shock affects net worth of banks and thereby lowers valuations and GDP. So it's just a beautiful model, and it just shows craftsmanship. Many of my students in the past were lucky to attend the summer school that Markus teaches at Princeton, and they all came back completely at awe with this framework, with a way of thinking of amplification mechanisms through networks of banks. At this stage, you may worry that Germans are taking over the AFA. That's because we all sound the same in English. In German, we are shockingly different from each other. Markus speaks Bavarian, and very strongly so, and he rolls his R. And I speak the dialect from Baden, which is a totally different region, also in the south. And when we talk with Stefan Negel, who is from Württemberg, or who speaks Swabian, it's very difficult to understand each other. But we're all Southerners, and so we listen with amazement to Ulrike Malmendier, the new vice president, and Antoinette Schur, the current editor of the JF, who speak High German. But that's because they're from the north of Frankfurt, which for us Southerners belongs to Scandinavia. And so they're not really Germans. And so we're really from very different places in Europe. So don't worry about Germans taking over the AFA. So with these words, let me pass the microphone to Markus, president of the AFA, an outstanding economist whose work I deeply admire and a great friend. Markus.
Thank you, Monika, and thanks to all for making this possible. I learned a lot from many of you, directly or indirectly. So I would like to talk about macrofinance and resilience, as Monika indicated already. And I want to start with a graph which I think is almost miraculous. If you look at the real GDP of the United States in log scale, for the last 100 years, you can go further, it lines up nicely on a line. Of course, there's some recessions here and there, and it goes up and down. Two things stand out, how nicely it lines up, and then there are two deviations. One is the Great Recession, which we recently experienced after 2007, 2008, and one is the Great Depression, and we only got out of it after the Second World War. And let me zoom in to the most recent years. When you zoom in, you see that, again, you see this nice line, and then you see a big break in 2008 and 2010, the recession, but we never came back. We never came back in terms of levels, and we never came back in terms of growth rate. And if you look at the COVID recession, which in its size was much bigger, but we came back to the old trend line. Now, what I want to talk about is why is it the case that financial crises are such resilience killer? Resilience, by resilience, I mean bouncing back after you're hit by a shock. Can you bounce back or not? And this is big. So if you just look at the gap between the GDP we would have in the United States, if we would have followed the last trend line, which we followed the last 100 years, it would be almost $4 trillion more. That's not accumulated, that's 1 year. Every year, we're missing $4 trillion. And this is accumulating every year. So the blue shaded area is just the accumulation of that. So it's related to some extent to long-run risk. So the non-resilience is essentially the long-run risk going on. And you see this huge break in terms of levels and growth rates of the financial crisis. So I would like to understand more what this resilience thing is and why it can't be bounced back. And so for this, I would like to define it, provide a measure, highlight a little bit what's the difference between risk management and resilience management, and what's the difference between macro and micro resilience. And then I bring this to macrofinance models and first generation, second generations, and apply then the resilience concepts across macrofinance. So what's resilience? Resilience is associated with a stochastic process. Is the stochastic process bouncing back? And the stochastic process can be anything. Can be a cash flow process, can be a return process, a GDP level or GDP growth rate process. It's all about bouncing back. And resilience is really about the adaptability of the system. Is the system able after a shock to change and adapt such that we can bounce back? Of course, we have a lot of risk measures like the variance or value at risk or expected shortfall. What is really then a good resilience measure? Is it a mean reversion, a half-life of a shock, or some cumulative impulse response function, the area under an impulse response function. And I would like to, highlight a different measure and propose a different measure here. So the first thing to realize when you think about resilience is that it's relative to non-adapting. What happens if the system adapts? Is it coming back because of the adaptation? But what is zero resilience? What's the benchmark? That's relative if the system does not adapt. So the way to think about this, if you think about the boxes in the lower part of the figure here, you can have an adaptive system. There's an exogenous process coming in, and then there are many endogenous processes, GDP process, cash flow processes, stock return processes coming out. And then you have relative to the non-adaptive system where the system is not adapting. And I call something zero resilience, something has no resilience, if you do the same as a non-adaptive system. And if you do better than this, if you bounce back better than this non-adaptive system, then it's a positive resilience. And if you do worse, the adaptation might also make the situation worse, then it's negative resilience. And one way to measure this resilience would be to take the benefits from adaptability. So the benefits you have, this adaptation might benefit things, and you value this. You take the present value of that. So it's, in a sense, it's the area, the discounted area under the path from recovering from that. So essentially, any resilience measure is about a measure. You want to collapse a whole process into a single number. And that's essentially one way to measure this. And a zero resilience measure essentially is one where the system does not adapt. But of course, it can also happen that the adaptation makes things worse because we react to shocks and make things worse, and then you have negative resilience. And it might be that we never come back, so we are trapped. So you end up in a trap. So traps is a very important component to it. Now, it could also be that once you hit a tipping point, that you have adverse feedback loops and the situation gets worse and worse and worse. And in that circumstances, this area actually, if it goes into the future further and further, it becomes minus infinity. Okay, so this measure essentially captures both the positive. Zero is if it's a non-adaptive system. Negative if the adaptation makes the situation worse. It could be so bad with adverse feedback loops and tipping points that it goes to minus infinity. Now, thinking from this, going from risk management to resilience management, it's a shift in mindset. You focus much more not on the risk, which materializes in the next period, but in the long run. So essentially, when you do risk management, it's all about the risk-return trade-off, and you do it at time t, what's the expected return, and what's the risk at time t. You can avoid risk, and if you look at the figure here, avoiding risk sometimes it costs you some expected return. It might be like in this particular example, the black line is no risk at all, but you might want to go for the more resilient path, which bounces back, and ultimately you might have a setback, but if you can bounce back, if it's resilient, it might be better off ultimately down the road. So you want to expose yourself to some risk, but you would like to diversify risk. And the diversification itself is different from a risk perspective than from a resilience perspective. But the key difference to resilience is risk you decide at time t. Resilience do you decide at time t+1. How do you react to a shock? So after you have the realization of the shock, you adapt, you change. And that gives you resilience. The adaptability gives you this resilience. So, but at time t, you have to do something already. At time t, you have to invest in your future adaptability, in your ability to react in an appropriate way, so that the system can react in an appropriate way. That means you have to invest in substitutability, in the ability to scale up, in scalability. In the context of finance, you might want to invest in something which has more liquidity because it allows you to adjust. And that's really the important insight here. Just to give you an example from the real trade, international trade context, if you have some outsourcing going on, you source from China and Brazil, you might say, oh, that's a risk management. I diversify across China and Brazil, let's say, by importing from both countries half-half. If something happens in one country, I still have the other country get still half of the input. Resilience management means I still outsource to both countries, but I actually outsource in such a way knowing that I can scale up. If something happens in one country, I scale up from the other country. I can easily substitute my inputs from one country to the other one. I can easily scale up as well. So this gives you this flexibility. So you open many doors so they can easily switch afterwards after you see this resilience. The other thing you want to do is you want to push away all these adaptability inhibitors, like the traps, the tipping points. You want to build up buffers to some extent because if you were to hit a tipping point, the whole system might spiral out of control. You get in these adverse feedback loops. So that's essentially what's very important. And there's a connection to, the Merton-Tonian hedging demand. There's a connection to long-run risk elements to it. So long-run risk, typically, you cannot diversify from a risk perspective. You can essentially only manage long-run risk by improving your adaptability to changes. And that's what I mean by resilience management. Now, resilience, you might say, if I look at the system and I have subsystems, I have an economy and I have sectors of an economy, or I have a portfolio, big portfolio of parts of the portfolio, so I have always subsystems. If each subsystem is resilient, it might make the bigger system also resilient. So how does it aggregate across units? And there is a fallacy of composition in a sense. Having a lot of resilience at the lower level is counterproductive at the higher level. And the easiest way to see it, if you have an economy where each firm is very resilient, so it can't go bankrupt, it bounces back very easily, it does not mean that the macroeconomy is very resilient, okay? Because then it's the case that you cannot adjust across the sectors. You have an apple and a banana sector. Both of them, there's some shock happening which makes just bananas way more productive than apples. You would like to adjust, but if the apple sector is so resilient, you can't bring it down, then it makes actually the whole macroeconomy less resilient. So that's a very important feature of resilience. Now, having defined what resilience is, what I mean by this, and how it interacts, I would like to put it into macro finance models. And in the first generation models and second generation models, and see why we need the second generation models to understand resilience further. So what I have in mind by macrofinance, of course, macrofinance is a big church, so there are a lot of things going, many papers and big contributions there, and I hope that it will flourish further, and it's a great field, and I'm fascinated by it. But it means it's general equilibrium, and it needs dynamics, because in order to talk about resilience, it has to be a dynamic system. It needs heterogeneous agents, because there are financial frictions in it. It's a core, the financial frictions, and if there's a homogeneous agent, it doesn't lend and borrow to each other. So you need some heterogeneous agent. And the frictions can come in different forms. There can be debt issuance constraints like borrowing constraints or collateral constraints, equity issuance constraints, or incomplete markets of uninsurable idiosyncratic risk. And the policy concerns is, as I mentioned initially in this example, if you look at the GDP growth of the United States or many other countries, you want to enhance growth and efficiency, but you also want to have stability and resilience, and you might also care about the equality in society or inequality. And finally, you might also care about having stable government financing, okay? Now, of course, in macrofinance, so it's more than just macro and finance. Here are two big bubbles. There's a huge intersection. That's a quiz for tonight, what these letters stand for. And it also touches upon monetary economics, public finance, but it touches on all areas within finance: intermediary finance, corporate finance, household finance, behavioral finance, asset pricing. All of them are part of it. Now let me go to the first generation macrofinance model, like Kiyotaki Moore, Bernanke Gotler-Gilchrist, and the Bewley-Ayagari type models, where it's essentially they're all linearized, log linearized out on the steady state. So here in particular, let's say, consider the Kiyotaki Moore, there's a temporary shock and then you bounce back. And if the system were not to adapt at all, it would follow this black line. But the system is adapting and makes the situation worse. So there's a shock, it's only a temporary shock, it leads to fire sales, it amplifies things, and it leads to a reaction like what's depicted here. And following this resilience measure, the resilience measure would be then capturing this red area under the black line. And you can see it has an amplification component, it has a propagation component to it, and it makes the whole situation worse. If we go to BGG, Bernanke Gotler-Gilchrist, you have the same phenomena going on in a DSG setting with price stickiness and other elements. In Bewley type models, you have more you have the incomplete markets setting, which leads to precautionary savings and depresses the risk-free interest rate in these models. Now, what you can do and what you learn a lot already in terms of resilience, you could say here the resilience is captured by mean reversion. So the mean reversion would be a good measure, or you can also take this area under the black line. But what you cannot analyze in these linearized models is something like traps or tipping points, because they're highly nonlinear. And I think these are very important to say, why is it the case since 2008 we're still at a much lower growth rate of GDP? Why are we still at a much lower level for so long? And it's the other thing which is case in these models, that once there is a shock and you're in a downturn, people anticipate perfectly well, with perfect foresight, how you go back to this steady state. Okay, there's no uncertainty anymore. There's no uncertainty about going forward. Now, if we want to analyze these traps and these tipping points, we have to go to second-generation models. And these are the nonlinear models kicking in. So here's a small shock. You see it is epsilon shock. It's amplified, but then it bounces back. And also, the blue line is the tipping point. What's on the other side, on the right side of the figure, is the drift of the system. You can see there's a state variable, let's say x, and then there's a drift on the y-axis. And if the shock is like this epsilon in this other figure, then it is the case that the drift will be positive and you drift back to this stochastic steady state. So whenever you're shocked, the x goes down, but then the drift is positive and then you drift back. Now, but if you have linear models, then the drift would always be linear in that space, like it is in this example. It is linear in this area. And it would be, in the first generation model, it would be always linear. The further you're shocked away from the system, the faster you drift back. Now, if you have tipping points like large shocks, where there's an epsilon shock and then you hit the tipping point, then instead of going back, actually you go further down. So the situation gets much worse. Or in this other diagram, if there's a shock which pushes you all the way down here, then you go beyond the tipping point, the drift is negative, then the system is after drifting away and you might be absorbed in this trap here. Okay, so that's essentially, you need these nonlinearities. That's very first order important to understand tipping points. And tipping points are also present if you have models with bubbles where, at some point the bubble is big enough, you hit the tipping point and then it bursts. And depending how large the bubble was, it might drag the whole system down. And that argues for your lean versus clean, whether you want to interact already to macroprudential regulation early on to slow down the buildup of the bubble or prevent the bubble to build up in order to make sure you not hit the tipping point when the bubble really bursts. Now, another element is, these were tipping points. Another one is traps. So there are two types of traps. One trap is when the system, the macroeconomy or the state of the firm or whatever it is, hits a trap, it can't get out of it anymore. So that's a perfect trap with no escape. It's an absorbing state. You can't get out of it. But there are also traps where you actually trapped for a while, for a long while, and then you can still get out of it. And one way to depict that is to have a station distribution of the system where it's double hump shaped. So if you look at this PDF here of the station distribution, so most of the time you're around here, but sometimes occasionally you trap down here and you spend a lot of time down here. So station distribution reflects how much on average the system spends if you let it run for a long time, and it's stuck here for a long time. So that's another way what often happens in this macrofinance model. You have this net worth trap. When the net worth is very low, you're trapped to get out of it. Now, with these two types of the first generation models where everything is linear, mean reversion, and after there's a shock, there's no additional shock. The second generation essentially is the tipping points and traps can be well analyzed. It's also very important for the second generation models that you have some volatility dynamics. So the volatility is not constant. The volatility moves around as well. So why is this very important in this? Because you have a risky recovery. You have a shock, and then the recovery, you don't know how long the recession will last. Will there be another shock? And there's a risky recovery. And everything is time varying, not only the first moments, but also the second moments, the risk itself. So the exogenous risk might not be time varying, but there's endogenous risk coming from the system because everything is amplified. And a lot of this time-varying risk comes through financial frictions. In particular, you have higher exogenous risks, then margins might go up, or the loan-to-value ratio might go down, leverage is going down, people start fire selling, and then the risk, the endogenous risk goes up, and that tightens margins further. Loan-to-value ratios go down further. And you get these margin spirals. You can also call it leverage cycles or repo runs. These are all just different names for the same thing. But the question of what mechanisms, and the literature has identified many different mechanisms, why these debt constraints might be more binding when the volatility goes up. It could be a value at risk constraint. It could be debt becomes more informationally sensitive. That's why the market breaks down. It could be because debt overhang problems kick in. That actually makes the whole constraint. That leads to this time-varying endogenous risk in the system. And if you have this time-varying endogenous risk in the system, it also means that people cut back on their consumption and they want to do more precautionary savings in some safe asset, and that essentially leads to more depressed situation, also prolonged depressed situation. This is like a resilience inhibitors. Now, going to the second generation models, everything is uncertain, so rather than having impulse response curves where say there's a shock and then we walk back deterministically, you want to depict things with a generalized impulse response functions like these fan charts, where you depict the difference between the distribution which would play out if there were no shock and the distribution which plays out when there is a shock, and the difference you depict in these fan charts. Now, one important element of resilience is to understand safe assets, okay? And this is very important in a sense. So it's a safe asset, there's a different take on it. It's not about the safe return. The safe asset is special because what you can do with a safe asset, okay? So take a model where there are incubate markets, there are frictions going on, uninsurable idiosyncratic risk. So everybody of us faces some funding shock, which you cannot insure with a bank or anybody else. And of course, the way you handle this, you save ex ante precautionarily with some safe asset. And so the agents cannot insure, so what they do is they save ex ante precautionarily, and then when they face a shock, they adapt. They sell the safe asset and get resources and then can readapt the system. So this insuring against idiosyncratic risk is essentially resilience because it's essentially about adaptability at T+1, as I mentioned before. Now, if you have a safe asset, the safe asset might still give you some cash flow, some interest payment, but what it really gives us is the service flow that you can adapt. You can change afterwards. And so I would like to show you the different asset pricing models. So typically when we do asset pricing, the price is just the expected present value of the cash flow with respect to the individual SDF. But if you write it with respect to a representative agent SDF, it's written as the present value of the cash flow plus the present value of the service flow. And the present value of the service flow comes from this retracing that we can insure each other through retracing later on. So some of you get a positive shock, others get a negative shock. We know we will get this in the future, and then we can retrade it. So even though this asset does not give us any cash flows, it gives us a very nice service flow that we can insure each other, even though markets are ex ante incomplete. So that's the value of a safe asset is to a large extent driven by this present value of service flows. Now, consider a situation that idiosyncratic risk gets worse whenever we go in a downturn. Seems very reasonable. Now, when a recession hits, we have much more idiosyncratic risk. We are more likely to go bankrupt and whatever is going on. Then actually you really value this service flow much more. So that means in downturns, this component of the value or the price component of the safe asset is expanding. That means it gives you more in downturns, the value goes up. It gives you a negative cap M beta. So idiosyncratically, it gives you a good insurance, resilience instrument. From a hedging perspective, from an aggregate risk perspective, if idiosyncratic risk goes up, it is also a good hedging instrument. So a safe asset gives you individual resilience and an aggregate hedging tool. And for both, this comes endogenously out of the system. Now, the other thing is what's special about safe assets. So it's a very good tool for individual risk, to uninsurable risk, and it's also a tool to have a negative beta. And it's also safe assets are often associated with bubbles. Okay? Why is that? There's a natural complementarity between bubbles and safe assets. So what a bubble, in order for a bubble to sustain in the long run, it has to, the return on this bubbly asset, R, has to be smaller than the growth rate of the economy. And if the bubble is attached to the safe asset, the expected return on the safe asset has to be smaller than the growth rate of the economy. So it has to, and it is depressed. It is depressed for several reasons. So one, if there's a lot of uninsurable idiosyncratic risk, people want to save more, and by saving more, you drive down the risk-free interest rate. That makes it easier to satisfy this R smaller than G condition. But it also means, and as I mentioned, the safe asset has a negative beta that also makes the expected return of the safe asset go down. So all of that makes it much easier for the safe asset to be bubbly than other assets. Okay? And of course, there might be an additional convenience yield on that. That also makes it easier to have a bubble on that. Now, from a macro perspective, safe assets also have some problems with resilience because you might lose the safe asset status. When you hit a tipping point and you lose the safe asset status, your country's government bond is suddenly not a safe asset anymore. People run away from that. When is that? That's, for example, when government debt becomes informationally sensitive. And when that happens, suddenly asymmetric information kicks in, and then the bid-ask spread widen, and you can't retrade it so fast anymore. And I told you, the key benefit of safe asset, you can retrade it very easily at the low bid-ask spread. And so if you can't retrade it anymore, then actually safety is lost. You lose the safe asset status, and the service flow goes away. Okay? It could also be that the bubble component of safe asset collapses. All of this gives you less resilience on a macro level. Another problem with safe asset is the asymmetric supply. There's a lot of literature saying we don't have enough safe assets. There's a shortage of safe assets, particularly after the global financial crisis. But the US Treasury has issued trillions of extra debt. So I would argue it's more the asymmetric supply on that. So the way to see it, there are certain countries when there is a downturn, people value the service flow, the safety flow much more, and then they're flying to safe asset, there's flight to safety. That benefits these countries, but it hurts the other countries where the money is flowing out. Okay? So this asymmetric supply of safe asset is very important on this. So let me summarize. So the retrading gives a fundamental resilience. That's what makes safe asset a resilience instrument from a micro perspective. But from a macro perspective, there are also some dangers because you might lose the safe asset status. That's a danger. And this asymmetric supply makes it which is the entity can provide the safe asset. If it's a government for one country, it's symmetrically distributed across the country. But in an international perspective, it's only for certain countries which can provide the safe asset in downturns. Now, so far, I haven't really talked much about the financial sector. And I think the financial sector is very important to take into account. Essentially, the financial sector is creating a lot of these safe assets. It's creating liquidity, creates money, the liability side, focusing on the liability side of the financial sector. And the big debate is, of course, who should create money? Should it be the public sector, central banks, governments, or should it be private banks? And which system is more resilient, provided the safe asset by the public or the private sector, or money by the sector? And of course, it relates to literature on narrow banking as opposed to fractional reserve banking, where essentially only the public sector can provide money. It relates to all the new thing on CBDC, central bank digital currency, which is extra money created by the public sector, as opposed to bank deposits created by the private sector. So all of these are very important issues in terms of resilience. So this interaction between price and financial stability and the private money creation and how this might hurt resilience, let me show how this plays out. So when there's a shock, the banks might shrink the balance sheets. They have to shrink the balance sheet and delever. Of course, on the asset side of the bank's balance sheets, they will shrink the balance sheet, of course. And this will lead what we talked about, amplification in levels, but also in volatility. And this will create a rich volatility dynamics. And the banks will actually be not able to absorb all idiosyncratic risk from the society and diversify it away. That's one role of the banks, is to diversify some of this idiosyncratic risk away. They might not be able to do so. But what's also very important is when banks shrink the balance sheet, or the financial sector more generally, they also shrink the liability side of their balance sheets. So they create less money. So money supply declines in the economy. On top of it, because the financial sector takes on less idiosyncratic risk from the firms and the households, these firms and households, they would like to shift their portfolio more towards a safe asset, more towards money. So there is an increase in demand of money. So you have a decline in the supply of money and an increase in demand of money. That means that leads to disinflationary pressure. And this disinflation hurts the banks again, because the banks have a lot of nominal liabilities. So they have some claims, nominal and real claims on the asset side, and on the liability side have mostly nominal claims, so that hurts them again. And there's this paradox of prudence. The banks, each bank might say, oh, I have to shrink my balance sheet, and that's actually prudent from an individual bank perspective, but it makes it at the macro level imprudent. And that's this, this paradox of prudence things. Of course, if you add runs to it and other nonlinearities, it adds to more complexity. Now, what the macrofinance literature is going to essentially, it has to split up to the financial sector in many subsectors. So, of course, the banks, within banks, there's a lot of heterogeneity, the traditional and shadow banks, pension and life insurance, asset managers, and so forth. And to put this in a macro model is very challenging, because essentially you need, for each subsector, you need a state variable. And so, it's very hard to handle macro models with so many state variables. But, newest technology with deep learning neural networks allows now to handle this multiple state variable macro models. And this systemic risk and spillovers from one bank to another bank, or from one subsector to another subsector, depends very much on the network structure and the design of the financial sector. So here is just very stylized. There on the left side I have a centralized network, and on the right side I have a distributed network. And of course the centralized network is way less resilient. If you take the center point out, the whole network is going down. If you have a distributed network, it's much more resilient. So that's the network structure matters a lot for resilience as well. So finally, and I indicated already, this was about the financial sector. What's about the public sector and the policy design? What about the governments and central banks? And of course, one big issue is government debt, how to connect that, and of course, it's connecting to the public finance literature as well. I mentioned already the exorbitant privilege. If you be able to issue a safe asset, you have this exorbitant privilege, possibly a bubbly asset. That solves this recent debt valuation puzzle. But it also, the resilience is also affected what that maturity you have to issue. There's a lot of open questions. What's the optimal debt maturity from a resilience perspective? How does the debt maturity and also the debt structure more generally spill over to the financial sector and then spill back to the official sector? That's connected to this diabolic doom loop, sovereign bank nexus literature. And of course, key on that is macroprudential policy. If you tighten macroprudential policy too much, you get into financial repression. Of course, you favor then much more debt financing, but this might actually trigger some other problems. And lender of last resort design, bailout policy, that essentially will then play out and will affect how the financial sector will respond to that and how the endogenous networks will form, the financial sector networks will form. It has also huge implications how to conduct monetary policy. Traditionally, monetary policy is very much focused on managing the risk-free rate, but to some extent through QE, the term premium. But the emphasis is much more focusing on risk premia as well, because by managing the risk premia, you manage also the endogenous risk and also the price of risk. So you would like to do occasionally redistributive monetary policy, which lowers the risk premium in order to give more resilience to the financial sector. And essentially you have to focus a bottleneck approach. You have to analyze where is the bottleneck, which sectors in the economy or subsectors in the economy are balance sheet impaired, and you have to fix that, otherwise you drag the other parts down with it. QE and QT is a classic example. After the global financial crisis, the housing sector was balance sheet impaired. So you want to actually buy mortgage-backed securities to prop up and help the housing sector or the households who own and have too highly leveraged housing. If you don't want to necessarily buy treasuries because it doesn't really help anybody's balance sheet. And it also has huge implications on the size and the equity of the central bank's balance sheet. So let me conclude. So I tried to convince you that resilience, in particular financial resilience, is first order important for macro. Resilience can be applied to any stochastic process. And how to think about resilience, I think I would like to invite you to think more about it in the context of many changes. We go through many big transition phases now, be it the green transition, artificial intelligence. We need systems which are resilient, and I think there's a lot of things to be done. There's only the first steps on this. We should actually not only do risk management, we should also do some resilience management. Think about how you can make the system more adaptable, invest in adaptability, in flexibility, liquidity, and things like that. Issues like traps, tipping points, and other resilience killers, that's the focus point. It's not about how risky something is. If you can come back from that, that's fine. If you can adapt to it, take the risk. If you can't, if you're trapped, if you hit a tipping point and the whole system spirals out of control, that's, I think, what you have to focus on. And the safe assets, with its negative beta, their individual resilience, and on the macro level, they help resilience too, because they give this exorbitant privilege. If you have this exorbitant privilege, in times of recessions, it's very easy for the finance minister or the US Treasury Secretary to run a stimulus program, and that enhances resilience again. If you're from a country which does not have this privilege, you have to run austerity programs, and that pushes the whole thing down. It gives you anti-resilience. And you might even lose the safe asset status. Finally, there's a lot of resilience spillovers within the financial sector and also then to the macroeconomy. As I mentioned, various policies, monetary, fiscal regulation, financial regulation, fiscal policy, they all feed into resilience. Thanks for your attention.
I'm handing Markus a plaque for the service for the AFA. Thank you very much for your presidency, and also the AFA Fellow Award, which turns out to be heavier. It's right here. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming. There's a reception outside. See you there.